And welcome everybody to the UN Science Policy Business Forum on the Environment. This is the third global session. My name is Charles Ross, and I'm the Director of the Economist Intelligence Unit's Public Policy and Thought Leadership Unit in Asia, and I am based in Singapore. So it's a good evening from me here in Singapore, and welcome to everybody that has joined us from all around the world for this, what is going to be a very exciting and stimulating 2-hour discussion with some really great speakers. It's a great pleasure for me to be leading the first of these discussions. This is the first day of 3. This one is on managing risk, pollution prevention and management, addressing e-waste through tracking, traceability and circular approach. The further sessions, which will happen over the next 3 days. Later today, the role of big data and frontier tech empowering sustainability. Tomorrow, we'll turn to marine waste, where I'll also be leading a discussion at the same time as this, followed by rethinking cities to be more sustainable a little bit later in the day. My colleague at the EIU, Pratima Singh, will lead a discussion on nature-positive food systems on Saturday. And the global session will end on Saturday with a session looking at how different sectors can work together to harness new technologies and scientific advances to solve global issues affecting our planet. So we're going to end on a really big note on Saturday. Before I get into the detail of our panel today, a few housekeeping notes. The session will be recorded and it will be available online after the event. There is an opportunity to ask questions as we go through. There'll be various stages during the sort of mini panels that we have during this session for you to be able to ask some questions. So please do use the question function on your platform to ask those questions, and we'll try to get to them as many as we can. I'll introduce each speaker as we go, but there are full bios on the session site, so you can see more there. So I won't take up too much of your time going into all that detail. And this session will be a busy one. We've got 13 excellent speakers coming from government, private sector and international organizations, all providing their own unique perspective on the topic. But we only have, excuse me, we only have 2 hours. So I'm going to be doing my best to keep each of our speakers to those 5-minute blocks so that we can keep to our 2-hour session. Now, during the course of this session, we're going to examine 6 key questions with the aim of generating actionable insights and policy recommendations by the end of the session. So we really want to get to the nuts and bolts of the questions that we're asking and get some actionable recommendations out of the other end. And so those questions are, e-waste has been an issue of concern for a number of years. Why does it continue to be a problem despite numerous efforts by government, industry, civil society, and international organizations? The second question we'll look at is, what are the main drivers of e-waste for becoming a global environmental challenge? The third is, what policies and regulatory mechanisms are best suited to tackling e-waste? And we're going to explore some really interesting examples on this discussion here today. And how do we deal with the informal sector and informal practices to manage e-waste? Fourth, how does the sustainable management of e-waste contribute to the circular economy, and how do we avoid the loss of valuable resources contained in e-waste? Fifth, can regional cooperation provide solutions to support developing countries lacking capacities for dealing with e-waste? So we'll look at that coordination that can happen between developed and developing markets. What role can industry play in dealing with e-waste in a sustainable way? Are there innovative solutions to e-waste from the manufacturing design perspective? So lots to cover today, so I'm going to get straight into it. First, I just want to set the scene around e-waste. And much of what we will talk about today does build on the work which was done by the Basel Convention, the wide-ranging policy and standard tools which were developed and agreed by its 188 parties to support the management of e-waste in an environmentally sound manner. Excuse me. And I would like to welcome Rolf Payet, excuse me, who is the Executive Secretary of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions. Welcome, Rolf, to the session today. Thank you for joining us. Just a question for you, in order to paint the scene and set the scene for this. Just to understand, is the Basel Convention doing its job? Do we have all the regulatory processes we need to tackle these problems?
Thank you very much, Charles. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all colleagues and participants. And it's an honor for me to provide some context to the discussions this morning. Now, if we look at what the Basel Convention was designed for, and many people, forget the preamble or the founding preamble of the Basel Convention. The founding preamble of the Basel Convention is basically threefold. The first one is to protect human health and the environment. So at the end of the day, we should be putting in all efforts, all energy, and all resources in whatever economic activity that we do or any products that we do. The primary aim of putting those products on the market and getting people to use them is ultimately also to ensure that these products protect human health and the environment. Not only when you are using it, I know companies spend millions to do research on ensuring that the equipment or the electronic equipment that we use is safe for us to use every day, but spend relatively less on when we have finished using this equipment, on how we can keep it safe and healthy for the environment. And I think that is one of the first principles upon which the Basel Convention is set up. The second principle is to do with how we look at a product, at the products and chemicals that we use, adopting a life cycle approach, which means that we consider, and it's related, of course, to the first principle, is when we develop a product, is we look at the whole life cycle. We don't leave the waste part to others. We don't forget about it. We don't put it somewhere where nobody sees it until it becomes a problem. The third one, and for me that's very important, is that countries or with sovereign rights, parties to the Basel Convention, it is the responsibility of those countries to deal with those types of wastes or these types of products, because these are being used by the population of that country, by the consumers in that country. When we try and shift this responsibility to the planet or to another country, then of course it touches on the whole aspect and the fundamental right for every human being to enjoy a clean and healthy planet. And that is the basis for Agenda 21, the whole Rio discussions on sustainability. But Basel Convention has this, ingrained in the convention. Now, of course, not all countries, and I come from a small island, and Singapore is also another small island, where you don't have the capabilities and capacities to deal with the complexity of, say, for example, to recycle a mobile phone. So what the Basel Convention provides for is the transboundary movement of waste so that they can go to countries who have the capacities and capabilities to deal with those wastes, to be able to recycle and, of course, manage those wastes in a sound manner. And this is the foundation of the Basel Convention. So it allows the world, the planet, the countries, the people to really take responsibility for their waste, look at it from a whole picture of that we are responsible for using those equipment and generating those waste, and providing opportunities for industry, for countries to develop the technologies for us to reduce the impacts of this waste. But what we've seen, of course, is we have, as you know, and I keep repeating this all the time, is we are close to every year generating 50 million tons of electronic waste. And by 2050, we will have 120 million tons of waste to deal with annually. And what is more worrying is that only 17.4% of this waste is actually collected and recycled, which means that it begs the question, where is this waste going? It is first going to landfills, whether it's properly managed or poorly managed. Secondly, it is illegally shipped across the world where there's no capacity. And thirdly, it is illegally traded, of course, to regions where children then needs food, or where women needs food, or where people need food, and they get these electronic materials and they just burn them, and they try and extract the gold and other precious resources from those materials. So the Basel Convention really creates that framework for countries and stakeholders to engage together to address this issue. And of course, the Basel Convention has been instrumental in pushing this forward by developing guidelines, by creating partnerships among industry. For example, we had the Partnership on Action on Computing Equipment, which generated guidelines which work with industry for for looking at computing equipment and mobile phones on how we can make them more recyclable. We also launched for several years now a MOOC, a massive open online course on e-waste to create more awareness. And we've had different audiences from universities, recyclers, policymakers, people from the telecommunications sectors as well, and even from others. And I just want to finish now that the work has not ended. In the last few years, we've been coming together as United Nations organizations because we feel that this is not something only for the Basel Convention, but also for other UN organizations. And from that, the e-waste coalition was formed, and we worked with the International Telecommunications Unit, the International Labour Organizations, the WHO, United Nations Environment Programme, to just name a few of the organizations that we're working with to try and address this issue from a global and international perspective. I think I will stop here unless you have other questions. Thank you.
No, thank you, Rolf. That's really interesting. And you quoted actually a few data points there to sort of give us an understanding of the scale of the challenge that we're facing here. And I think what is interesting is I also had some data points I was going to quote, but they're different to yours. And I think that is part of the sort of the challenge that we're facing here, that it's really difficult to quantify the scale of this challenge. But our next speaker is going to try and help us do that. So I'm going to welcome Pascal Leroy, who is the Director General, International Association of Electronic Waste Producer Responsibility Organizations, the WE Forum, to join us. Welcome, Pascal. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Now, I just want to understand from you, do you think the figures that Rolf quoted there are sort of accurate? They reflect the size and scale of this challenge, or is it sort of a fairly conservative picture? Because we're looking and we're seeing the sort of COVID-19 is spurring the purchase of electronic equipment to aid remote working. We're also seeing 5G coming online now, and that's likely to increase the rate of upgrades. What are you seeing, Pascal? How can you spend some time just quantifying the scale of the challenge here for us?
Thank you, Charles. I'd like to echo what Rolf Payet was saying. The figures that he mentioned are absolutely what we have all concluded in the past few years. I mean, this is really an international effort to estimate the global e-waste trend. So he said 54 million tons today, and this is going up to 74 million tons in 2030 and up to 120 million tons in 2050. So this is really, it is not just an issue of concern, it's an issue of growing concern. And the dent in the curve is not in sight. It's really an issue of great concern. And the nature of the problem, as Rolf Payet was underlying, is first of all environmental, of course. So we need to make sure that this doesn't contaminate, it doesn't continue to contaminate the environment. There's also a health impact, of course. There's also that we have to look at products holistically, which is also in the preamble of the Basel Convention. And it is the responsibility of the countries to make sure that the e-waste is dealt with properly. But I would like to add a few more points to this. And that is that, first of all, there's the aspect of critical raw materials. So it's not just pollution and toxicity, but also many products contain critical raw materials, which are materials that are important for business, but the supply of which is risky because they come from countries where you have conflicts, or because or from authoritarian regimes. And it's an issue of great concern for Europe, for example. It's less of concern for other parts of the world. But in Europe, for example, there's not so much mining as opposed to other parts of the world. So the critical raw materials. And a second aspect that has not been underlined yet is the one of carbon dioxide footprint, the CO2 footprint. So mining is associated with much bigger global emissions of CO2 compared to recycling. And that's one of the other reasons why we need to continue to stimulate recycling and secondary raw materials. And Charles, you mentioned correctly 5G. It's one of the things that that is all, we can't get our head around it, because on the one hand, we need new technologies to advance our societies and to understand the traceability of products and the tracking of products. So we need all this, and also to have better life, to increase the welfare of people. But on the other hand, it will also, in X years' time, give rise to new forms of e-waste. And so it's really a conundrum, and we have not figured out yet, I haven't seen any figures yet that show to us that one will be at the detriment of the other, that that we are going to be successful in managing that e-waste problem. It's really, so far, the jury is out, and we have no idea whether or not we will be successful in that respect.
Excellent. Yeah, I was hearing in the news, I think it was earlier today, that Apple, when they did launch their new iPhone with their 5G compatible iPhone, did have their best sales figures for any of their handsets so far. So there clearly is a huge surge in demand there. I'm considering getting one for myself, but I haven't upgraded for about 4 years. So I'm probably due for an upgrade. I think I will do my best to recycle my old device though. So thank you both, Pascal and Rolf. I think you've done a pretty good job of sort of painting a picture of the challenge that we're facing, that it is going to get more challenging into the future, but there is some sort of uncertainty around what that might look like. And I just want to move on now to look at the first of those questions, which I mentioned earlier on, to understand why does the issue of e-waste continue to be a global challenge despite all of these international efforts to address it. And to help me answer this question, we've got three speakers joining us. Michelle Suren, who's the Senior Policy Advisor, International Chemicals and Waste Management Division from the Federal Office for the Environment in Switzerland. Good morning. Carla Silva Fillo, who's the President, International Solid Waste Association, and Olga Speranskaya, who is the Co-Director and Senior Advisor, Health and Environment Justice Support, and Senior Advisor for the International Pollutants Elimination Network. Welcome all to this session. So I want to start just by getting an understanding from each of you to sort of understand about your unique experiences in regards to the efforts which are being undertaken. And I might start with you, Michelle, if I may. And I wanted to ask you, could you give us a sense of the current approach that Switzerland is taking at the moment from your perspective?
Yes, and hello everyone, and thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here, and thanks for that question, Charles. So from my perspective, why is this issue continuing to be such a big issue? I think, as mentioned by Rolf, we have the framework in place, the Basel Convention, that is the Global Waste Convention that allows governments, parties of that convention to go about that problem, gives them the opportunity to work with manuals and guidelines and toolkits and establish, most importantly, the regulation to attack this problem. I think, though, the main challenge is that nevertheless, we still are in the situation that we don't have the information that we require in order to put in place the right measures. And I think out of the numbers that, as Pascal Leroy has also confirmed, there are actually a growing concern just regarding the sheer numbers. I think in addition to that, the concern is that we don't know where it ends up. So we don't have the information on all of these transboundary movements to know where does it go, and how can we redirect, if necessary, those shipments to places where environmentally sound management can be ensured. So I would say that the problem is that for about 80% of that e-waste generated, we don't know where it ends up, and therefore it is very difficult to have in the right places the state-of-the-art technology to ensure the recycling, and we therefore very much have to work on this, to generating this information of where it goes, and we have been doing some thinking, but we can talk about that a bit later also. But that would definitely change the situation as such, and then also allow for other measures to be taken.
You mentioned track and trace as being a big challenge. In your view, who do you think should be accountable for tracking and tracing of e-waste?
So I think this is something that the different actors should be doing together. You know, like this is everyone has to take up responsibilities. So this is about producers, retailers, distributors, exporters, importers, recyclers, and then of course the governments. I mean, the governments, they have to develop and put in place and enforce the needed regulations to make sure that we have this this tracking, and that we can do the monitoring. And again, I mean, the Basel Convention and its parties have this role to play through this global waste convention, and in particular also, as Rolf said, you know, the countries, there are many countries that have difficulties to ensure this environmentally sound management. So the Basel Convention really is a framework that, you know, helps parties to take up that responsibility, but also to ensure the parties can get help, and the parties can get also protection through different procedures that are in place. And so I think it's all actors, and the governments do have a very important role to play, would be my response to you.
Thank you. I think it's a theme we're going to hear of throughout the next hour and a half, that we're speaking about individual responsibilities is required, whether that was from the producers at a country level and so on and so forth. I want to move to you, Carlos, if I may, and just get a feel from you around a sense of the current international situation in terms of the efforts which are being undertaken. If you could give us some insight into that in your view. Carlos. Do we have Carlos? If not, I'll give Carlos a moment. Hopefully he'll come back, and I'll move on to Olga, if I may. A question for you, just to get your own perspective representing civil society on this issue and what its role might be. We've talked about, and a few of Michelle was just talking about sort of individual responsibility around this issue. What is the perspective from civil society in this, and maybe around that responsibility piece?
Thank you very much, Charles. And first, I would like to echo what Rolf Pett said at the very beginning, that there are too many electronic products on the market which quickly become waste, and some of them are even designed to be single-use, like, for example, many cartridges and printers. Also, the demand for electronic products is growing, not only because people are looking for fancy products, but to reduce the need of replacement of electronic products, especially mobile phones, by consumers. The upgradability of storage components should be ensured to offer software support and updates for longer, and this will also contribute to e-waste minimization. But another issue that should be addressed is the need to minimize and eventually eliminate the use of materials that are hard or impossible to recycle, such as, for example, fiberglass in computer monitors or PVC in cables and wires. And not all countries have the capacity to recycle such components. So one more issue that prevents the problem of e-waste to be addressed is the lack of transparency of information on the toxic content of electronic products throughout product life cycle, and including waste. So broken and obsolete electronic devices do not only litter the place, they also contaminate the environment, the food chain, people with thousands of toxic chemicals that leak from e-waste into the air, water, and soil. And these chemicals are really hazardous, and they are carcinogen and mutagen and endocrine disrupting chemicals. And information about their presence in electronic products and in e-waste is not disclosed, making workers at the facility that produces them, as well as waste recyclers, vulnerable to exposure. So to address the problem of transparency and traceability of information about chemicals of concern in electronics is important, as it will be a step towards preventing the presence of these chemicals in products and in waste, and will continue to a safe and toxic-free circular economy. So, but it is obvious that unfortunately producers should disclose information about toxic chemicals in electronics and take the responsibility of recycling them in a proper way, and ensure that electronic waste and obsolete electronic products are not dumped in countries where they cannot be recycled safely. So unfortunately, not all countries give high priority to considering chemical toxicity in the design of electronic products, and countries regulate these products and e-waste in different ways. And the lack of generally accepted and harmonized principles for the regulation of hazardous substances in electronics result in different waste in different waste management policies. So there are some regional and national regulations that aim to limit the use of certain hazardous substances in electronics and reduce waste management concern. However, many countries and middle-income and low-income countries lack such regulations and lack their enforcement. And of course, there is the need for helping countries to address the issue, including through putting in place common standards that offer high protection to human health and the environment, and sort of like level playing fields. And this is very relevant to electronic products manufacturing and to e-waste management, because having the correct international standards can help develop sustainable waste management systems. So in conclusion, I may say that from our perspective, an efficient e-waste management is based on government commitments, regulatory requirements and enforcement, and a social orientation towards separate waste collection and environment and health protection through safe, toxic-free product design and transparency of chemical information.
Thank you, Olga. You touched on some really interesting points. We're going to cover things like the circular economy and life cycles a little bit later. But we have just had a question from the audience here, which I would like to pose to you, actually. And the question is there a global framework that guides the life cycle of e-waste? And if not, why not? Is that something we need to do?
Okay, so the question for me, I think that very important attention should be paid on the Basel Convention as the international treaty that addresses the electronic waste and trade in waste, and including the electronic waste, and meeting the requirements of the Basel Convention is the key, and all stakeholders should be part of this initiative, including the civil society. And the role of civil society is huge, actually, because we not only raise awareness of different stakeholders, but we generate data from the ground. So we work with the communities, and we conduct sampling analysis of environmental media. We track illegal trade of hazardous waste, including electronic waste. So this information should be used by governments and industry as the basis for their efforts, and should help them take the right decision and invest into innovations and green electronic design and sustainable recycling practices, and actually think twice before considering exporting obsolete electronic products into low-income countries where they will be burned, will be vanished in landfills, and the pollution continues. So the work of NGOs helps to make the right decision in the interest of people and the environment, and in the implementation of the international chemical agreements as well.
Thank you, Olga. Just wondering if any of my other panelists have any sort of insight they could share in regards to that question around global frameworks that guide the life cycle of e-waste. Whether you have any sort of knowledge, experience that you can share with our audience around that. Happy to take it from anybody who is out there. No problem. If you don't, Pascal.
Hi, this is Lark from the United States.
Sorry, yes, Lark.
Pascal.
No, go ahead, Lark.
Yeah, so I mean, I think when we think about global frameworks, you know, I think the Basel Convention has a lot to offer here, but ultimately it's really, you know, countries also need to take it upon themselves to think about how they do their own waste management. I think this is something that Olga touched on as well. You know, the vast majority of electronics are domestically generated. It's not always trade that's contributing to the need to handle e-waste in a proper manner. And so I think the Basel Convention does have a lot of information to help countries in terms of environmentally sound management, not just of e-waste, but of many different types of waste and how to design landfills. And they even have technical information really just related to environmentally sound management. So I think some of this has to be driven internally in a country as well, and helping them improve their own domestic waste management systems so that, you know, everybody has this level playing field where we all have an opportunity to, you know, for environmentally sound management, whether it happens in a country, in a regional neighbor, or, you know, you need to trade farther afield to get that management. And it's wonderful that the Basel Convention provides for that.
Thank you, Lark. I will come back to you shortly. Pascal, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Olga said and Lark, in that I think it's also important to go beyond the currently existing framework agreements. And this is already going on. I mean, you have so many multilateral agreements and partnerships and alliances. We should not expect all the solutions to come from governmental intervention. So there's also research programs, there are practical relationships between organizations. There's so much that we can do, and that is currently already taking place. It's quite phenomenal, the number of alliances and partnerships. Also manufacturers, we shouldn't discount the initiatives that all the multinationals and the manufacturers take to address the problem. I mean, it's really a huge problem, and they realize it and they do something about it. It's just that there's so much coordination that needs to take place, and this goes beyond what Basel can do, which is just a framework agreement.
Yeah, I would echo that. There certainly is a lot of investment happening from the manufacturers, and a lot of eyes on this. We've got somebody from IBM coming up a little bit later. They might talk a little bit about what they're doing in terms of their initiatives. I'm just going to move on slightly now and to our second question. Second topic, which is looking at what policies, regulatory mechanisms, and models of regional cooperation are best suited to tackle e-waste. We're really fortunate on this panel here to have a mix of representatives from developed and developing countries as well. So I also want to understand what are the particular challenges faced by each of those groups of countries, and whether they can efficiently address by national legislation. To help me answer this question, we'd like to introduce our next three speakers. We have Cynthia Asa-Bediako, who is the Chief Director, Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology and Innovation from Ghana. Welcome. Trisha Bijal, who is the Technical Officer, Technical Services Department, Environmental Management Authority from Trinidad and Tobago. Welcome as well. And Seika Sano, who is the Deputy Director, Industrial and Hazardous Waste Management Division, Ministry of Environment from Japan. Welcome, everybody. I would like to start with you, Cynthia, if I can. And a question just to understand, how would improving e-waste governance benefit developing nations such as your own? Cynthia.
Thank you very much for the presentation and the participation. And generally speaking, the improvement of e-waste management would not only just benefit Ghana, but the continent and all other related individuals, because it has such a transboundary movement and network of related issues. And for that matter, it is critical that all countries, especially those of us who are signed on to the Basel Convention, take critical interest in ensuring the management of e-waste. In Ghana, in our effort to do that, it's one of the few countries that have come out with an Act 917, and subsequent legislation on how to manage electronic waste in Ghana. And seriously, as we all are aware, managing electronic waste, it's a multi-sectorial issue in that it has a number of phases, from the life cycle of the electronic equipment and the electronic product to its final disposal and use. And for that matter, it cuts across a number of sectors. From some of our previous speakers, we're talking about the importers, we're talking about the users, and we're talking about the regulators. In Ghana, the main sector that is responsible for managing the electronic waste, we say that it rests with government, who is the regulator. We have the regulatory agency, that is the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the government agency on the ground to collaborate with the public, private, and civil society organizations when it comes to managing electronic waste. There have been various attempts and efforts to ensure this comprehensive collaboration of all these agencies in managing it, recognizing the critical and the hazardous nature of some of the contents and how it impacts on the economy, the individuals, and the environment, which are very critical in everything that we are doing. And so in terms of regulation, there is a regulation, LI 2250, and an Act 917, which seeks to manage electronic waste and all electronic products. We are, however, faced with challenges that we can also discuss, and that has to do with the disposal mechanisms, which is also lacking in that we lack the segregation of our waste, which means that the dumping of electronic waste in landfill sites and its impact and effect on both our soil, the individuals, and the environment is quite high. And so there is also, that is on the local ground, there is also the problem of dumping through this boundary movement, of bringing in some of these electronic equipment into our countries. Whilst we've designated an entry point to enable us to track, trace, and manage, we have loose ports where these things sometimes may seep in into the country, and which makes tracing and managing it quite difficult. However, we believe that with the strict enforcement of our existing regulations and the various participation of the key stakeholders who constitute the policy regulatory teams, we should be able, in consultation and in collaboration with our international partners, especially in signing in and domesticating the Basel Conventions, should be able to handle electronic waste in the country and within the sub-region. So in effect, what we're saying is that Ghana agrees and is very much particular about the growing volumes and the effect of electronic and electrical waste on the environment and in our economy, on our health. We have taken steps to come out with an act and a legislation that is expected to help us regulate it. We have an agency in place that is also working in this direction. And when it comes to the international laws, we have a focal person and a focal point who is working together with other agencies to ensure that we domesticate the Basel Conventions and make regular reports and monitor the use of these things. So eventually, we are hoping that such fora will give more information, open the discussion, and then enable all of us to actively take good care of the electronic and electrical waste that is creating a lot of anxiety to nations, and especially in developing countries where sometimes the capacity to manage them is a little challenging. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cynthia, for sharing. Really interesting to hear about all of the measures, initiatives that you are taking at a country level, just in terms of strong policy, strong enforcement, and taking responsibility over the sort of the tracking and tracing element of it as well. I guess what is clear is that all countries across the world, depending on your size and makeup and the nature of your country, you have different challenges associated with managing e-waste. So I'd like to get and understand a slightly different perspective from Tricia, if I could bring you into the conversation, just to understand if sort of what Cynthia was talking about was sort of resonating with what you're doing, or the sort of specific challenges that you're facing as a small island developing state are different, and whether you could sort of shed a bit of light on that for us, Tricia.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you to the UNEP for inviting Trinidad and Tobago to the session. I'd like to agree with some of the points which my colleague from Ghana indicated. Similar issues, similar challenges, where Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean as a region also face the same challenges with establishing regional standards to distinguish e-waste from non-waste. Regional standards will allow for a common understanding of e-waste versus non-waste and control the import and distribution of used equipment, which has the potential to become e-waste in a short period of time. And a regional standard would require the efforts of competent authorities across the Caribbean and focal points, customs officers, governmental agencies, to establish a standard which could be replicated domestically to allow a country as a nation to restrict or prohibit the movement of certain types of used goods and electronic waste. And also, as a region, there's need for continuous assessments of the generation, the flows, the management of e-waste, because what happens is that such activities tend to occur under enabling conditions, so under an international project or regional project, and there is need for some sort of fixed schedule to routinely identify and monitor areas which are of high waste generation, monitor the routes under which e-waste would travel, used equipment would travel, and further characterize the waste so that as the data develops, you will get more data-driven policy and legislation developing to focus on maybe certain types of e-waste which are problematic. And then, while most countries in the Caribbean are parties to the Basel Convention, what you would find is that some parties may not have domestic legislation to give effect to the enforcement mechanisms of the Basel Convention. So what tends to happen sometimes is that competent authorities would work together on a case-by-case basis to tackle potential cases of illegal traffic under the Basel Convention. And while there may not be a legislative framework, a regulatory framework to address all cases of illegal traffic, once you do so on a case-by-case basis, you develop the capacity for countries to identify gaps in their own domestic situation and develop mechanisms to monitor the movements of waste, to increase communication among competent authorities, and work together through the Basel Convention Regional Center as well, to if that is a means of ensuring or enabling communication among competent authorities. And then nationally, it's important for countries to have national definitions for waste, because once all stakeholders agree on a national definition of waste, then developing policy and legislation standards programs becomes a little more easier, because everybody speaks the same language on what is considered waste versus non-waste. And another challenge that the region is working on is building the institutional arrangements. So as my colleague in Ghana indicated, multiple agencies have a role to play in waste management. So you may find environmental agencies work on permitting, trade offices focus on policy, customs focus on border control, and there's need for more joint enforcement activities at the national level, because of the challenges and restrictions financially or related to human resources, joint efforts allow multiple agencies to combine their resources to tackle cases of illegal traffic or to minimize the import of used equipment, which could become e-waste. And then finally, another measure which could be implemented domestically legislation or regionally is a framework for sustainable financing mechanisms for waste management. So as in many developing countries, the onus and the financing for waste management falls mainly on the government and not really on the manufacturers, importers, distributors. And there's need for examination of the financing mechanisms that could probably take away some of the burden of the disposal costs associated with e-waste, if not in the form of levies, taxes, tariffs, tax incentives to invest in green products or greener products or green manufacturing and so on. And also to establish a framework that would allow the costs or the finances coming in from those mechanisms to be diverted into waste management activities, so that the government wouldn't take on the burden as a whole in ensuring that waste is managed properly. And with everything, the effective implementation of legislation and regulation really needs public support. So you need to keep engaging your stakeholders, the public, governmental, non-governmental, to build that appreciation of the efforts on the ground, so that when legislation is enacted, all the stakeholders who may be affected would be able to help the government a bit in ensuring that waste is managed properly.
Excellent. Thank you, Tricia. Thank you for sharing. I know that you, both yourself, Trinidad and Japan, are members of the expert working group on the e-waste technical guidelines, and I might ask you both about that sort of shortly, about your highlights and sort of takeaways from that working group. But first, Saiko, if I could turn to you, if I may, just to understand from you in terms of regional cooperation, which is cooperation is a theme which is running through a lot of the things that people are talking about here today, as is tracking and tracing of e-waste and how imperative it is to tackling the problem. Saiko, in your view, who is accountable for tracking and tracing of e-waste? I know I've asked this of some other panelists already, but I'd love to get your view on that as well, Saiko.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, first of all, to have me here. It's a very great pleasure. As earlier mentioned, I'm trying to echo that yes, the stakeholders and actors take each responsibility to track and then trace those export and imports, of course, including the government, of course. The key actors, especially, I think, in my view, is of course the exporter and the importers, because their products or waste or whatever you call, they're in their hands. So first of all, how it's very important to establish the kind of the value to share, that how big impact that their trades have for the export countries and of course importing countries, and of course that kind of action to raise the awareness among those actors is the responsibility of the government and other international cooperation or the regional groups, I think. And the overall, as with regard to the tracking, and that's my opinion so far. And the thing is to how to improve the quality of the tracking or tracing in that region is I think it's very difficult, because of course the key actor is exporter and importer, as I said. However, as a government, the regional group or the multi-stakeholders, they don't have any kind of direct eyes to see that trade happening at the ground. So the action to take is to have the scheme to do that. But the thing is that this is also already mentioned by many of our colleagues. The country have the different standards or the regulation on the e-waste, or how to distinguish e-waste from the used equipment, which is not waste. That is very difficult. And then you mentioned the EWG work. I'd like to say that yes, we have the paramount value that to have that the one single unified common regulation among our the parties is the good thing, of course. And we work very, very hard under that export working group to make that one regulation. And it is adopted by the COP14, however, interim. And the last thing is it's very difficult because the many countries have the different point of views, and we didn't make it through the last point. But we can, I think we can do that. We can do another thing rather than the one unified global standard. What we are doing in the Asian region is that we are doing the annual meetings in Asia region to exchange the information of each the different parties, because especially in the Southeast Asia, there are many countries have many background, and they have some specific the market for the e-waste or equipment, electric equipment, and they have a very different regulation, and we don't know basically what's going on in other countries. So the exchanging information is very, very important to smooth that trade in the regions, because we have a lot of number of the e-waste, the used equipment trade. So that beside of that very global unified standard making process, we are doing what we can do.
Excellent, thank you. Tricia mentioned a little bit earlier the challenge around definitions and defining exactly what is e-waste and from non-e-waste. Is that something which is on the agenda for the expert working group on the e-waste technical guidelines? Tricia or Seika, could you either of you respond to that?
I can take the question. So yes, the expert working group on the e-waste technical guidelines is seeking to define criteria or recommend criteria which could be used to distinguish used equipment destined for reuse or refurbishment for further reuse versus e-waste. So the technical guidelines were adopted at interim, and at present, the expert working group has reached a stage of further defining the recommendations on the type of documentation and information which should be requested from potential exporters and importers before the actual movement of used equipment. So once finalized, countries could either go the path of adopting sections of the guidelines as a whole, or using the guidelines to inform their national standards development. So, which brings me back to my point on national standards, whether voluntary or compulsory. And in my opinion, I believe compulsory standards would be more effective, would provide that assurance that for importers, manufacturers to follow a particular legislative or regulatory requirement in their design or import of used equipment which is destined for reuse or refurbishment for further reuse. So the expert working group is at the stage of further refining the technical guidelines to make it, yes, there may be challenges with all countries agreeing on each paragraph of the guidelines, but generally it is a recommendation. A guideline is a recommendation, and as much as possible, all countries would try to build the guidelines to a point where it could be easily interpreted at the national level.
Thank you, Tricia, for providing a bit more detail around that. I just wanted to go to a question, if I can, from the audience, which has come up. And this is, I guess, a challenge that we all face for some of these discussions, that to some extent we're sort of talking an echo chamber here, because we all know about the how important and how critically important it is, the issue around dealing with e-waste. But that is sort of that awareness of that challenge is not evenly felt across the population, particularly sort of the general population having a relatively low understanding of how much of a big issue this is. And so I wonder what if I'll open this to anybody as well, if they want to respond to this, how many of our initiatives need to be focused on improving awareness as a goal? So do we not just have the bottom down approach, but also a bottom up approach to top down to a bottom up approach to raising awareness around this issue? What if anybody wanted to respond to that? Pascal.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. I think awareness is really one of the pillars of tackling the e-waste issue. And that's why it's actually sad that the e-waste issue is less of a perceived less of a concern than plastics, for example. In the past few years, we have seen so much focus on plastics in the oceans and so on that that is really a big problem. But e-waste is not perceived as equally, let's say, urgent and important to tackle. And I think, and this is something I deplore. And the point is that countries that are setting up extended producer responsibility schemes, they should clearly make producers responsible for information. And this is what the e-waste legislation in Europe, for example, takes care of. Producers and producer responsibility organizations are responsible for informing consumers, and they are also the ones, for example, the PROs in my organization, the WeForm, they are taking care of awareness raising initiatives. So there's so much that we can do, and this takes time, of course, but there's no solution to solving the e-waste problem without raising awareness raising initiatives.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Does anybody else have any sort of specific initiatives that they wanted to point out at this point, which are focused on around awareness whether it's at a country level or something? Yes, Tricia.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, so in Trinidad and Tobago, while there may not be specific legislation targeted to e-waste only, there are other pieces of legislation that regulates the activities of facilities receiving e-waste for treatment and disposal, either for pre-processing activities, sorting, etc. So under those pieces of legislation, which are focused on general environmental permits, permits focused on water pollution, air pollution, and so on, the awareness building activities surrounding those pieces of legislation to the public would raise their awareness of who should be accepting their waste and how waste should be treated, so that the efforts through building stakeholder awareness and consultation on pieces of legislation allows the public to have a greater understanding of how e-waste or waste in general should be managed, and who are the persons that should ideally accept their waste for treatment and disposal.
Thank you, Tricia. Thank you for sharing. Sorry, Rolf, you had your hand up. If you just a minute to contribute before we move on, thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. And of course, the discussion is really right on the topic. How can we have a proper system in place to ensure that we can recover those precious materials from the e-waste? The challenges are immense, and this is no mean feat, but we need to push at it. I mean, the first thing is the consumer issue. Now, I can ask the question here, how many of you have surrendered your mobiles for recycling? In the last maybe 10, 20 years you've been using your mobiles. Many people hoard their mobiles or hoard their computers because of the information that it contains on there. We don't have yet a system for deleting those information before we hand it over to somebody to recycling it. So many people keep it. And this is one of the challenges one company who's been trying to recycle their devices have been facing. They say, we want the devices to be recycled, but many of the people don't want to part with the electronic materials, or they end up in another place and then thrown away. That's the first technical problem. The second other problem is, of course, the tracing, and this has been mentioned here. How do we put in place a system that can trace? And I've had the opportunity of visiting many recycling facilities, and it is clear with these recyclers, for them protecting the proprietary information when they recycle servers, when they recycle computers from universities, from companies, that they need to convey to those consumers, or users of these computers, that their data is not being, leaked out or shared. Then I've seen within recycling companies that there are two sections, basically three sections. One that look at those computers to see whether they can be reused. And a lot of these materials, whether it's memory, hard disks, whatever, can be reused, or even the boards. So trying to have an integrated approach rather than trying, and in Basel Convention, we spent a lot of hours, and I wish to thank all these experts to try and put these guidelines together. I understand the challenge, but we need to really have a common language whereby recycling producers, consumers can communicate together and also provide this kind of security, because dealing with IT equipment involves, I think, kind of privacy, security, and data management, which sometimes we forget about. So just saying that we are focusing on but we need to find solutions to those challenges so that things may be solved. And just to give you a simple example, a university paid a contractor to recycle his electronic materials because they were changing all their computers. And through a tagging system, they found out it ended up in a developing country where it was being burnt by kids to extract the material. So how does a consumer also ensure that the disposal that they are paying for is actually going to where it's going? So we need a transparent, accountable tracking system, and that is definitely one of the primary solutions we need to find. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ralph, for sharing. You've talked about the valuable information that are on these electronic devices. I just want to shift gears a little bit now and talk about the valuable materials which these electronics are being made of, including those of strategic value such as indium and palladium, and precious metals such as gold, copper, and silver. So these materials can be recovered and recycled from our electronic devices, thereby serving as a valuable source of secondary raw materials, reducing pressure on scarce natural resources, as well as minimizing the overall environmental footprint. So the sort of the motivation from an environmental commercial perspective is quite high to be able to get these valuable materials out. So in this section, I want to discuss how the sustainable management of e-waste can help avoid losses of valuable resources and contribute to the circular economy, and really sort of understand what are the main barriers associated with that. And so I want to introduce our next three set of speakers to us today. Lark Williams, who you have already heard from briefly earlier on. She is the Foreign Affairs Officer, Department of State from the USA. Brendan Egerton, who is Director of the Circular Economy, World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And finally, Vanessa Gray, who is Head of Environment and Emergency Telecommunication from ITU. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for joining us today. And Lark, I might start with you, if I may. When we talk about this handling of valuable resources, where the level of track and trace is low, we've all talked about that as being an issue here. It is perhaps unsurprising that a flourishing black market would develop around these rare and sort of valuable resources, components within these electronics. How much of a problem, what if you could paint a picture, how much of a problem is this, and what steps are being taken to counter it? Lark.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's something that we all recognize is a really important issue. And I think a lot of my colleagues have talked about the difficulties. I mean, we just heard from Rolf about how difficult it is to ensure, you know, when e-waste is a waste and it's managed in that way, or when it needs to go for some other operation. And so it's I think at a really basic level, it's hard to make that distinction. And that's something we heard from Trisha. That's something we heard from other speakers as well. And so, you know, in our perspective, we really want to keep the value of this material to encourage sustainable management. And so in the United States, you know, we really strongly support managing all waste and scrap electrical and electronic equipment. We call that e-waste and e-scrap. And we like to make that distinction because, you know, there are valuable materials that can be extracted through a recycling process. And we want to keep the value and retain that for that material. And so, you know, we also think about the dichotomy of when is something hazardous and when is non-hazardous, and how we can continue to support as much robust trade as possible in these materials, recognizing that for some materials, you know, the purpose of the convention is to really help ensure that to the extent possible. And so, you know, for hazardous materials, the convention has a number of, it has the prior informed consent procedures that ensure, you know, a country is able to know what's coming in. And we think it's really important to apply those to hazardous materials. And then for non-hazardous materials, you know, we don't want to set up any trade barriers. We really want to find ways to encourage the trade of this material. And so if it's used electrical equipment, you know, what I'm just going to call used equipment, we want to incentivize that trade. And that, you know, what I'm talking about here is used equipment that can go for reuse, that can go be refurbished, repaired, something that still has useful life. We want to extend that useful life as long as possible. And I mean, I think there are a lot of benefits to that. If people want to hang on to their used equipment, you know, I think Rolf offers a good way to, let's think about mechanisms so that we can ensure if somebody wants to recycle it or reuse it or repair and refurbishment, depending on that operation, you know, they can be comfortable that their data is gone. You know, so thinking about different types of policies that really can promote sustainable management and prevent, you know, the loss of valuable resources. I mean, for a country like the United States, we're not actually a party to the Basel Convention. So I'm the Basel focal point, but, you know, we don't participate as other countries, but we've been supportive of day one of the Basel Convention and really, you know, much of its approach. I wouldn't say we support everything, but I think it really does offer a lot of good information. And so from our perspective, you know, countries to be able to have this sustainable management framework also really need to recognize that much of this waste is generated domestically. And so how do you build in a system that can ensure environmentally sound management? And I talked a little bit about this earlier. Not every country has to have everything. That is the benefit of trade. And I think there's a lot of economic and environmental benefits that can come from ensuring this material goes to the right place where it can be managed in an environmentally sound manner. And I think, we do want to find these Black markets. And I think Rolf gave a really great example of, this is something that's not working, and we're supportive of identifying ways to make it work. We also don't want to inhibit the trade of these materials. And so, in thinking about this, really one of the most important policies, and Tricia, touched on this as well, is that waste, non-waste dichotomy. And I think for us, we're really concerned with some of the proposed amendments to the convention and really enabling enough time to ensure that we can understand their impacts and vis-a-vis this waste, non-waste, because a used piece of equipment has useful life, and we should extract the maximum amount of useful life from it for, promoting a sustainable materials world and I know other countries call this circular economy. We often refer to it as resource efficiency, but we do want to extract the most that we can out of these. And I think, we heard about mining and how, intensive that is on the environment. And so it doesn't make sense to use and dump these, especially when there's useful life yet. And so I think, we are really supportive of this. I think the e-waste guidelines, what we affectionately call them, for folks in the Basel Convention space, these do really go a long way towards helping think about that criteria of when something is a waste and when something isn't a waste. But there are a number of other guidelines in the convention that can help countries, also, raise the level of their environmentally sound management of all waste. And I think that helps support, overall good management and using materials in a sustainable way.
Thank you, Lark. You mentioned the circular economy and sort of the need for people to think about the whole life cycle of their products. And Brendan, this is an area where you are sort of a lot of your focus is on. I'm just wondering if you could give us your view on how developed is industry thinking around this? Are they on board with this? To what extent are they thinking about the whole life cycle of a product, of a project?
Yes, thank you for the invitation. And a quick answer to your question is absolutely. Some of them have been thinking about it for years now, but as we've touched on a number of times today, even if industry had all the solutions, they still couldn't do it by themselves. So there's no shortage of barriers. Most of them are interlinked with one another, requiring multiple stakeholders to overcome them. However, taking a systems perspective is what's necessary and allows us to grasp the portfolio of different solutions that are needed to change the markets, to change policies and change our behaviors. What we'll need to address to address the e-waste at the appropriate scale is to have the right mixture of commitment, coordination, and collaboration, I think each of which have been brought up today. And as an example of this, over the past year, 7 organizations, including WBCSD, their member organizations or member companies from the electronics industry have come together to align on a vision and roadmap for circular electronics. This goes back to the publication of a new circular vision for electronics, which was published with ITU, World Economic Forum, PACE, and with the support of the UN E-Waste Coalition. And we brought together these companies, over 30 companies from around the world, to think about this vision and roadmap. We did this with the Global Electronics Council, the Global Enabling Sustainability Initiative, ITU, Platform for Accelerating Circular Economy, Responsible Business Alliance, World Economic Forum, and like I mentioned, WBCSD. And the idea was to create a mega platform for industry to honestly and safely discussing the barriers, the solutions, and the stakeholders required to be part of those solutions. So what's more is we've turned these barrier discussions into proposed actions, identifying the key stakeholders that need to be a part of them. In fact, in going through this process with these companies over the past year, we've found dozens of different interventions that are needed in the coming years in order for the industry to achieve circularity. And that's all across the life cycle, to your point, from design, procurement, business models, reverse logistics, recycling, and finally scaling use of secondary materials. So all of this will be captured in a roadmap that we'll produce actually in exactly 1 month's time and will be made public for all to see. But the roadmap and the actions that are in it, the co-authors, the idea is that, you know, while we have this coordinated plan, it's important to move quickly towards action in this coordinated collective way. I think what we want to avoid, similar to what Pascal mentioned before, is this cacophony of initiatives that we've seen responding to the plastics challenge, because everyone has a different idea of what needs to happen. At this point, we still don't know how much we're moving the needle on that. And so what we need from the very beginning is this coordinated action, not only across industry, which is what this circular electronics partnership will become, but then to plug into the UN e-waste coalition, and with that, the Basel Stockholm Rotterdam conversations, and make a concerted effort to work across sectors in order to solve this. So, you know, I'll just conclude with, you know, while it is important for industry to step up and act on these, and they certainly have the ambition to, they alone cannot solve this. So it's going to require enabling and incentivizing policies to create the playing field that gives more circular solutions economic viability. We need the recovery infrastructure that's needed regionally to capture the products and components and materials after use, as is touched on today. And until we get that recovery infrastructure, it's going to be difficult to engage consumers and say, this is how you return your electronics. There's nothing there. So it's going to be a situation, again, where everyone has a role, and it's going to be difficult as a result. But nonetheless, it's important that we understand the importance of, or it's been critical that we understand the value of working with one another in this.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan. Clearly, it's an integrated approach which needs to be taken here. And one thing which can help people sort of get on board with that is being able to quantify the sort of the size of the opportunity. And we've been talking about data a little bit on the session here today. And I just wanted to bring Vanessa in, because I understand you have some new data, relatively new data, that you were able to share with us today through ITU's e-waste Monitor 2020. I'm going to hand over to you. I believe you've got some slides you're going to share with us as well.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, if we could have those slides up, that'd be great.
Yeah, the technology will catch up with us. Sure, they're working on it.
Yeah, anyway, maybe I can just get started. So a little bit of focus on three key areas, especially if we talk in terms of, you know, barriers that we're facing, including in, you know, extracting more value. And the first is on the data and statistics. The second is around policies and regulation. And the third is around coordination and cooperation. And we already heard you know, a number of statistics today, and it's true, you know, so ITU together with partners UNU, UNITAR, and the Global E-Waste Statistics Partnership, we produce data on, you know, how much e-waste is generated, how much e-waste is recycled. And we've seen, you know, growing amount of e-waste is mainly fueled by higher consumption rates of electrical and electronic equipment, short life cycles, and also few repair options still, unfortunately. And here we also need to be aware that with the current pandemic, use of electrical and electronic equipment is expected to increase. I think it's too early to have the exact numbers, but those will, you know, we'll have those over the next few years. And also we see COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the dependence on ICT infrastructure and connectivity, with demand and use really increasing. And we've also seen in some cases, there's an indication that during the pandemic, replacing is easier than repair, which is obviously also, you know, a problem. If we can just move to the second slide, please. We know that the value of raw materials in the global e-waste that was generated in 2019 is equal to approximately approximately 57 billion US dollars. And just to put this in perspective, this is more than the GDP in most countries. And iron, copper, and gold contribute mostly to this value. And with a current documented collection and recycling rate of only 17%, a raw material value of about $10 billion is currently recovered in an environmentally sound way from e-waste globally. And 4 million tons of raw material could be made available for recycling. So in summary, we know it's essential to substantially increase the officially documented 17% of global e-waste, the collection and recycling rate, especially in view of the rapid growth of this waste stream, and also the need, of course, to reduce the use of virgin materials, which is, of course, limited. But something else I want to highlight is that we also need more and better data. So we produce these statistics, but still we rely a lot on estimates. And in this respect, ITU, together again with UNITAR, UNU, and the Global E-Waste Statistics Partnership, is engaged in capacity building and training on national statistical offices to help us have more countries with better data, because we know only with good data can we track the progress we're making, we can identify the challenges, and also then adapt our policies. And this now takes me to the second point on policies and regulation. We know that as of today, 71% of the world's population is covered by national e-waste policy, legislation, or regulation. Again, there's a difference of having this in place and implementing it. But improvements have been made since 2014, when we only had 44% of the population that was covered. And the high coverage rate is affected by the fact that the most populous countries, such as China and India, have national legal instruments in place today. However, the population coverage equates to only 78 of the 193 countries that we cover. And so less than half of all countries in the world are currently covered by a policy, legislation, or regulation, and we are actively working towards addressing this challenge. If I can have the next slide, please. So one of the main barriers to achieving sustainable e-waste management goes back to the all actors approach, whereby we need government working together and industry working together. And without a conversation between government and industry, progress will not be made at the policy level. And I think a number of speakers have highlighted this. This is also amplified considering the current trend towards globally extended producer responsibility in the management of e-waste. And so what we've done at the international level is that we have built the e-waste coalition. Brendan mentioned this before, which brings together 10 UN agencies working in the area of e-waste. This is ITU, UN Environment, UNITAR, UNU, UNIDO, BRS, UN Habitat, WHO, ITC, and ILO. And the UN e-waste coalition comprises these 10 UN entities who've come together to really strengthen their collaboration across different areas comprising ICTs, industry, trade, environment, data, labor, health, small, medium enterprises, and municipalities. And these sectors must work together to overcome the barrier of lack of knowledge. And the coalition, which is currently hosted by ITU, works in the areas of advocacy, knowledge, and also joint implementation, in particular to support countries to reduce and manage e-waste, and also to increase awareness and engagement of key e-waste stakeholders at the global, regional, national, and also at the local level. And again, I'm very pleased to see also Brendan on this panel, since of course the Circular Electronics Partnership is another great example of collaboration and highlighting the need for industry collaboration. And the UN e-waste coalition looks forward to strengthening cooperation in this regard on the many facets of electronics and e-waste across the life cycle and the supply chain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanessa. Really interesting. Thank you for going into the detail around that. Clearly a very good example of collaboration, and you're ticking, I think, a lot of the boxes of the challenges which people have highlighted on the discussion here today. I just want to sort of skip back in time a little bit, because I noticed that Carlos has rejoined us on the call. Carlos Silva Filo is the President, International Solid Waste Association. Carlos, just want to give you an opportunity to give us your view. You come from an international perspective, and to sort of give us an understanding of what you're seeing from an international perspective in terms of the Solid Waste Association.
Thank you, Charles. And from our side, the International Solid Waste Association, as the world's leading network promoting professional and sustainable waste and resource management. So here we are taking care of both sides of the same coin, as mentioned before. And ISVA considers e-waste as a key issue and has dedicated increased attention to this topic, having contributed to the production of this global waste monitor for many years now. And what we see is that with changing consumption and production patterns, electronic equipment have become a part of every aspect of our daily lives, as it has been said as well. And we know that nowadays there are considerably more electronic equipments than people in today's generation. So this is an increasing challenge, and this makes this e-waste stream the world's fastest growing domestic waste fraction, and fueled by many people by buying electronic equipment with shorter life cycles and fewer options for repair. As we just heard from ITU, there are less than 8 countries in the world that either have a policy for managing e-waste or are putting regulation in place. So this is one of the biggest challenges we face. And despite multilateral environmental agreements in place, such as the Basel Convention and other conventions, such as international directives like the United Nations Environmental Assembly resolutions and several coalitions and partnerships, the cost to monitor, track, collect, recover and recycle e-waste is still an issue. And the enforcement of these agreements and instruments is a matter of concern. And what we must bear in mind, just taking from the point of your last question, is that e-waste does not only contain precious materials. E-waste also contains several chemicals and harmful substances that must be really dealt and treated accordingly, and to which we must ensure a safe and sound environmentally destination. So we hope that all the efforts made until now by ISVA and our partners and several other institutions to track this growing problem can encourage governments and the related industry to act with an urgency that reflects the scale of this challenge. And what we need really to ensure is this e-waste receive an adequate and safe destination, that we ensure that all the costs are really managed, and we need to ensure that recovery and recycling schemes are in place in different areas of the world to ensure that all this growing amount will be having an adequate final disposal. And just a final reminder, the waste industry, represented by ISVA, represented by our members, is ready to assist on that.
Thank you, Carlos, for that contribution. I think I saw, Michelle, did I see your hand up there a moment ago? Did you want to jump in there?
Yes, thank you so much, Charles. A quick reaction, if you allow, to this very interesting presentations of Vanessa and Carlos with the figure and the data and how they are together with many other actors are working on those, which is very appreciated. It is striking me that for the fastest growing waste stream, we are relying on these estimates. We're very glad to have those estimates, because we don't have the data, and I think it really, in order to tackle the problem, we have to improve on that. We need data. We need to have more information, refine the estimates, especially that. Vanessa showed the global recycling rate, 17.4%, so less than 20% is recycled. I mean, for pretty much 80% of the e-waste, we don't know really where it ends up. And as Carlos said, actually, we should be able to ensure it ends up in adequate and safe destinations where we have the state-of-the-art technology to recycle it. And so today, this is not given, and this is the reason why within the Basel Convention, the governments of Ghana and Switzerland have made a proposal to improve on that, and the proposal is actually to control the transboundary movements of all e-waste, because currently, the so-called hazardous e-waste is being controlled. We've heard earlier in the discussion the distinction between hazardous e-waste, non-hazardous e-waste, which leaves a big amount of e-waste transboundary movements uncontrolled, and we don't have the information, and that's why we have this lack of data that would allow to ensure through additional measures environmentally sound management of e-waste. And therefore, the government of Ghana and the government of Switzerland are proposing to all parties of the Basel Convention to consider amending the Basel Convention in the way that all of the transboundary movements of e-waste are being controlled and monitored, because in the end, whether it is hazardous or not, if it ends up in the wrong place, it is damaging to the environment and the people. And as we've seen, the big amounts of useful parts and the huge value that was just described is being lost. So from the point of view of environmental and human health, but also from economic point of view, for to increase the circular economy, it would be very important to adopt this amendment proposal to Basel Convention. So I thought this was a good point in time to let you know about this. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Michelle, for sharing that recommendation. A perfect timing for it. Thank you. In terms of time, we've got just over 25 or bang on 25 minutes left for the session. So I just want to move on to our last question of discussion here. And we've touched on this a little bit during our discussion already, but I want to end the session today to focus on the role of industry in sustainably managing e-waste. What are manufacturing and design and other innovations needed to be driven by producers of electronics to help manage the problem? So to help answer this question, excuse me, I'll introduce our last two speakers for the day. Bruce Anderson, who is the Managing Director for Global Electronics Industry at IBM. Welcome, Bruce. And Shalini Sharma, who is the co-founder and CEO of E-Waste Exchange. Welcome, Shalini. So Bruce, if I could ask you first, how can we ensure tech doesn't become obsolete so quickly? Can we better think about repairability and recycling when first designing products? How can this be sort of bedded into the way we design, the technology we create? It's sort of the holy grail question that we want to know here.
Yeah, Charles, what I would say is first you have to divide the electronics into what I'll call enterprise electronics versus consumer electronics. And so consumer electronics, I think, there's always this downward pressure on price. And so it almost incents, I'll say disposable electronics. And so we have to be very careful about that because in certain categories, say white goods, refrigerators, et cetera, we are seeing vast differences around the world in terms of, say, some companies building these devices that are going to last 20, 25 years, and others building them to where they might last 5. And so it really does behoove everyone to just really start to think about that longevity point. But I wanted to use an example of what IBM's been doing around enterprise electronics. So as you would imagine, our electronics that we produce for the enterprises of the world, mainframes, servers, et cetera, they're quite valuable. And so, and we often finance those purchases for our clients. So we've actually been doing track and trace globally for over 25 years. And as we take a look at not only the higher value products, but also back when we were in the PC industry, and we are still a major consumer of PCs with 350,000 employees, we actually have been we developed a service we call Global Asset Recovery Services. We've had it around for 25 years. We've processed almost $2.4 billion worth of, 2.4 billion pounds of electronics, and less than 1% of the laptops and other things that we brought back wound up in a landfill, less than 1%. So I think to what everyone's been saying, if you can come up with the way to design for longevity, if you can come up with the way to track and trace through the life cycle, you can actually reduce the amount of e-waste, at the end. And I think what we're seeing now as we look around the industry, we're seeing a lot of focus on the things that you mentioned, longevity, the ability to repair, or the right to repair, which I think is really important in the way that governments can probably influence the way that these designs are turning out, and very important in the consumer markets. Refurbishing is a core part of our global asset recovery services. We've actually used advanced analytics to examine the bill of materials of these electronics and then figure out what is the next best use for those electronics. So it isn't so much of a guessing game, as I've kind of heard some of the speakers talk about. In enterprise electronics especially, you can use advanced math to actually figure that out. And then as we take a look at all the components inside, you're starting to see, and I think Apple's been very public with their Daisy machine now, the same robotics that are used to assemble the electronics in the first place are now being used to disassemble the electronics. And so it starts to change, Charles, the economic value proposition of recycling. And so your ability to recover the components is actually increasing and doing it more for an economic reason. And then finally, what I would say is when you start to get into separating the components and actually recovering the materials, you can extend that track and trace. And someone used the example of data. And we're actually working on different blockchain applications that can not only track a hard drive, because of GDPR and other regulations, people are very worried for a different reason about the data coming off. And that is an inhibitor, as Rolf mentioned, to people actually turning over the electronics. But if you can guarantee that those things are going to be wiped, and you're putting that responsibility back on the inventor of the hard drive itself to make sure that those things can be cleaned, then you can actually start to unlock that. So we're starting to see advanced technologies, Charles, really get into the whole problem of minimizing the amount of e-waste in the design, and then actually helping us to kind of accelerate the cycle.
Yeah, really interesting, Bruce, the sharing the level, the sophistication of the infrastructure that you clearly have at IBM to be able to undertake the track and tracing, to do what you've done with all of your 230,000 employees and their electronic devices, and how none of it is going into the landfill. There's a pretty strong established infrastructure, I guess, that you're drawing on there. And I just want to sort of touch on that with Shalini, if I might, because that's I mean, it's not infrastructure which is necessarily replicable all over the world. Everyone can't draw on this sort of infrastructure. And I sort of wonder, from Shalini, if you could share, how far are we off from having sort of the infrastructure that we need to be able to do sort of certainly many of the things that Bruce was talking about, and the rest of us here as well.
So, hello everybody. As advised by the forum, I should share the unique situation of e-waste management scenario in India and as well as the policies in India. So thus, instead of starting from our innovation e-waste exchange, I'm taking you for a brief journey of the e-waste management scenario in India. Probably I will try to cover our ground experience, then policies, and then innovation, everything in very few minutes. So very quickly, in January 2018, when I was getting ready to visit a cluster of an informal players, suddenly I got a call from a person on the other side and he said, "Madam, please don't visit us today." So the panic in the voice was very clear. So I asked, "What happened?" And he said that there was a child age 11. He was dismantling a motor, but actually it was a detonator. It is blasted and child is no more. So now if we talk about this situation, it is not specific to India, but many more countries in Africa and Southeast Asia. So this is a very common scenario. So next we talk about India, that is, there is a fact that still India is having about 90% of e-waste going to the informal players, and that consists of more than 65% of child labor. Now I'm talking about the ground data that we are experienced on working with. Wondering about the reasons? So I will say here many businesses and organizations, they still float tender to sell their e-waste to earn profits. When such competitions are organized, cost of the waste goes high, which is compensated on the ground by using the informal players or the child labor. Secondly, there are existing cartels. The policies emerged in last 4 to 5 years, but e-waste has been treated since last 20 to 25 years through the existing connects and system, so the transition is cumbersome. Now a bit about policies. India launched e-waste management policy 2016, but due to the lack of clarity on the extended producer responsibility targets that were not clear, there was an amendment launched in year 2018 that specified the incremental extended producer responsibility targets, right, starting from 10% in year 2018. It is increasing by 10% every year up to 70% of take-back systems that need to be established by the producers and the manufacturers by 2023. Apart from the take-back system, the EPR targets and EPR targets, there is a provision of establishing a new infrastructure, inclusion of municipalities to manage the recyclable resources, and to create the large-scale awareness. But the implementation of policy is a bit slow because of the paucity of the awareness regarding regulations, paucity of willingness to implement permanent structure and systems to sustain EPR compliance. With these details, I'm pleased to share about our innovation e-waste exchange and its extension, Sustainability Exchange. Earlier during this session, we heard that even after making significant efforts, the e-waste problem is still continuing. Each of us are using 5 to 7 gadgets and appliances, and those when not in use kept lying in our bedrooms or the living rooms, but we don't know about the destination of these gadgets and appliances. This is a huge issue, and I request your attention on the fact that this issue exists because we lack the accessible and the convenient infrastructure to send these gadgets and appliances to its correct destination, that is recycling unit. And to solve such grave challenge, we designed e-waste exchange. To define what e-waste exchange is, I will say it is a convenient and accessible infrastructure, a digital infrastructure, to channelize your electronic waste from the citizens, from businesses and organizations directly to the authorized recycler for the safe recycling. We designed this as a digital circular economy model, and it is recognized as highly commended the Circulars 2019 by World Economic Forum Davos. This innovation helps to map the flow of e-waste from the source to destination, map the critical metals and resource recovery, and ensure environment-friendly and child labor-free recycling. We piloted in around 2 cities with more than 1 million population, and experienced that efficiency of this model is more than 99% of preventing the leakage of e-waste and the child labor. Moving a step ahead from digital infrastructure e-waste exchange, in April 2020, we filed a patent on Sustainability Exchange. That is a tech-based platform to generate and trade sustainability credits for the extended producer responsibility compliance. Here we measure as 1 ton of e-waste equal to 1 e-sustainability credits. These credits are set to emerge as a most attractive and valuable asset for image-conscious responsible brands, especially who want to achieve EPR compliance or to achieve e-waste neutrality and plastic neutrality. Of course, the carbon calculators at the back end will help to achieve carbon neutrality too. Most importantly, the data is useful for the governments to assess the status of EPR compliance in their states and help them for informed decision-making. Fair mechanism help strengthen the recycling infrastructure in the countries, and fair wages lead to the streamlining the informal sector. These are the ways we are working to transform the e-waste management sector across India and similar economies. I look forward associating and working with UN Science Business Policy Forum and the decision makers and all here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalini. That's really interesting. So you said you're focused on 2 cities at the moment. I'd be interested to see sort of how that is able to be sort of scaled up and spread out and applied to other areas. I mean, clearly having the right infrastructure in place is critical for us to be able to achieve what we need to achieve. And it's clear that there are many places where that infrastructure doesn't exist. I want to touch on that, Bruce, if I could ask you a follow-up question around that. I mean, as is always the case, you need to build a strong business case to be able to do this, to have in this sense a strong circular e-waste value chain for the private sector. There has to be a business case. It has to be make sense commercially. Do you have thoughts on sort of how far we are away from having solid business cases? Are there good examples out there that you have seen of good business cases for this?
Yeah, I think if you take a look across industries, you'll see that the more that we can design electronics to be refurbished and remarketed, we can extend the life of these and actually just reduce the size of the problem. And you've seen it in different industries, in automotive, where major companies get involved in the aftermarket of the fleet, right? And you are seeing that in the handset industry now, where the companies that produce the handsets are pulling those back in as fast as they can, because it does allow them to refurbish and repurpose those for other markets. And so again, it extends that life and reduces the raw manufacturing that is out there. And I think some of the challenges that I think people have brought up are really critical. When you try to do track and trace in order to recover those assets, and bring them back at end of life, that's very tricky. Most serialized assets that enterprises have, they track those things pretty tightly, because they're depreciating them. They're recovering them when their employees leave, things like that. That's not true in the consumer market. The most likely place in the consumer market is actually going to be warranty. So when you look at it, if the consumers and the producers were actually registering these warranties, and bringing that back together, you'd have a chance at implementing track and trace at the consumer level. But unfortunately, that technology right now, the way that process is run, less than 15% of the people actually return that warranty card. And so that's been a problem in the industry for decades. So track and trace of consumer has been very, very difficult to do. But I do think that as we see more connected products, that warranty registration is going up. So now you've actually got it from producer through retail into the consumer's hands. And if you think about it, every consumer that owns an automobile, of course, it's licensed. It's the government knows that you have it. You have to insure it. So I think we need to take some of those concepts and try to miniaturize those. And then that way, by the time we get over to places like the e-waste exchange, you're actually working with some information about what is it that's in front of me. I've got this device that's come back, and that's really where some of the automation technology is coming in, Charles. When you take a look at what we can do with visual analytics and literally using an advanced camera, take a look at a product and know that this particular device is this model, if we get the serial number, we'll actually know what's inside there, what is available in there to be recovered, right? And that's a major problem and a major cost as you get into that whole disassembly and liberation, process.
Thank you, Bruce. We've got a little bit less than 10 minutes to go. I've just got a question in from the audience, which I'm going to open up to the crowd here. So the question is: most waste management systems underpinned by regulation are based around making it easier for collective EPR to work. How can individual extended producer responsibility be advocated more in the regulatory space? How could it be given more room in this space so that individual supply chain efforts can be supported? I wonder who would like to take that question. Anybody keen? Yes, Pascal, thank you.
In European legislation, producers are legally, individually responsible, but they choose to handle the issue collectively. That's the point. And I think it's not just in Europe. In all the parts of Europe, we all come to the same conclusion, which is that producers can become individually legally responsible, whilst at the same time clubbing together to tackle the e-waste issue collectively.
Thank you. Seika.
Thank you. In Japanese legislation, if you want to treat the waste, you need a licensee. However, the producer of specific products, if they want to collect their used products, they don't need a licensee. That's the very specific benefit for the producers to do that, because they don't have they don't take the cost to collect. Because they don't need a licensee. That's the scheme that Japan has.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've got one more question. Carlos, to you. I'll go to you next.
Charles, that question makes me reflect, and after following the discussion, that we are always looking at this issue under a perspective of a final thing, that a product has become a waste, and then we need really to find something to deal with these joint materials of different natures. What I want to say here is that we need to emphasize the role of a circular economy in the way we produce these goods. We need to cooperate better and in close contact with manufacturers to change the way the products are designed, are created, are distributed, and most importantly, the way they are recovered at the end of its lifespan. So I don't believe on individual approaches, but better would be a multi-stakeholder engagement system in place to consistently deal with these different equipments that are present in many parts of the world. We have the same equipment going around all over the world, and the same stream, so the same product. And this is what we really need to develop tailor-made solutions and provide opportunities to support the creation of this a true circular economy system and a more sustainable society.
Yeah, really good point. Thank you. We're just about out of time. If anybody else has a final thought they wanted to share, anything. Bruce.
Charles, just very quickly, I think it relates to the points, the question you just had. One of the things we're seeing now, and a lot of people have pointed to the design of the product in the first place. We're now actually seeing people using AI to actually score designs. And what I mean by that is we've always scored a design on, what is it going to cost? We've scored a design on, is it reusing existing, components. But now people are starting to score designs on, is this a recyclable product? And it's fairly new, and it is very complex question you're going to ask, engineers to consider. But it is something that I think is very promising.
Thank you, Bruce. Excellent. So I think we're just about out of time, and where we've been chatting today, I've been taking down lots of notes and wanted to share some of my thoughts of some interesting key takeaways from the discussion here today. And sort of what came to mind to me was that old adage from Peter Drucker, which still holds, I think, here, that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that sort of that challenge of the data challenge of being able to really understand the issue, whether it's around track and trace or so on and so forth, is a real challenge that needs to be addressed, and a lot of work needs to be done. Although I do recognize that some individuals have talked about some of the initiatives that have been happening on this call. So data is clearly a key here. Countries must get better at monitoring the flow of electronics through the life cycle of the product so that they can be better tracked and traced. That's a current theme coming through and through as we've been discussing. This, of course, will make it much easier to recover and recycle those products. The big challenge we have is the transboundary movement of e-waste, which makes it managing it a whole world problem. It cuts across national boundaries, and it necessitates a partnership between governments in both developing and developed worlds alike, along with international organizations and, of course, the private sector. And amongst other things, this is needed to build in order to build the global infrastructure, which we do need in order to recycle, repair, and finance e-waste as well. And Shalini was talking about some of the things that they've been doing around that in India, which is really encouraging. And we've heard today from the people that can really sort of make this cooperation happen. We've got all of the stakeholders in the room here today, in the virtual room here today. And so we know what an important issue this is. We need to help raise awareness with the wider community what an important issue it is, because if we don't deal with it, then depending on which data that you're drawing on, the e-waste generator will be 20% higher again in 5 years' time. This is sort of exponential growth in the amount of e-waste which is being created and produced. So sort of my thoughts around this topic. I want to thank all of our speakers here today, every one of you, for joining us from around the world, for sharing your insights and your view from both from an international perspective, but also from a national level and an industry level. It's been really interesting and really informative for me. So thank you very much for participating on this event. Thank you very much to the organizers of the event. And I will say that the next session, which is coming up, which is happening in almost exactly 30 minutes time, we'll be focusing on the official opening of this session, and have a session on big data and frontier technology powering the transition to a sustainable future. So I encourage all of you out there to take a 30-minute tea, coffee, breakfast break, whatever you need to, and come back to us and participate in that next session, which is coming up. And then, of course, the sessions which I talked about earlier on, which are happening tomorrow and again on Saturday as well. Really appreciate all of your time spending the last 2 hours with you. I hope you found it useful, informative, and as enjoyable as I have. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Charles, for the moderation.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Moderation.